Welcome everyone to yet another exciting episode of Path to Code. Thank you for joining in. Good morning and good evening based on the time zone which you are located in. So today's session is going to be interesting. We're going to be talking about something that has been spoken about for a while now and has been recently introduced, and we're going to be talking about Lightning Web Components today. Before that, my name is Jigar Shah. I'm an enterprise solutions architect, a global community speaker, and Jigar Shah 189 is my LinkedIn as well as Twitter handle. So, if you have questions after this session as well, please feel free to reach out to me on these Twitter handles, and I'll, do my best to help answer your questions. So, what do we have in store for us today? So we're going to be learning about what are the pillars of modern web development, since Lightning Web Component is a byproduct of the modern web development paradigms. We're going to be looking at what are the dev tools that we can use for Lightning Web Component development. And then we're going to dissect a Lightning Web Component and really see what it is made up of, the different parts and pieces, the nuts and bolts that really make it up. We're also going to understand, what is the life cycle of a Lightning Web Component, which is very essential. We're going to learn about some fundamentals like decorators and the nitty-gritties that we need to write a Lightning Web Component. I mean the code for Lightning Web Components. We're also going to build out a simple Lightning Web Component and see how it works. So that is what we really have in store for us today as a part of today's session. Before we start, some housekeeping rules. Please mute your mic. Keep adding questions to the Q&A window. We will be addressing all the questions in the last 15 minutes of the session. Just in case we run out of time, you can post the questions on our blog or our YouTube channel, and we can, we'll be able to answer those there as well. Please don't shy away from asking questions. No questions are silly, and everybody learns in the process. So let's get started with Lightning Web Components. So today's session will be more of a introduction and help you understand Lightning Web Components in a general way. We also have a session planned with Amit Chaudhary, who's going to be diving deep into Lightning Web Components, and he is going to explain how Lightning Web Component events can be leveraged to interact and do some complex stuff. So just in case if you feel that today's session we're not covering all the concepts, don't be bogged down. It's just an introduction. So before we jump into Lightning Components, one of the key things to understand is web development since the time of ECMAScript 6 has really evolved. So earlier JavaScript was not very, very powerful, but with the advent of ES6, it has some really powerful features that has made web development easy, a lot more modular and reusable. And the picture that you see on the screen in front of you defines the 4 most common pillars of modern web development. So let's just understand what these are. You might hear these terminologies often when if you're a JavaScript developer or have done some kind of JavaScript development on the newer versions of JavaScript. Okay, so first of all, the modern web component development paradigm is based on custom elements, which means that the development is based on the ability to create finer granular elements. And when I'm really talking about modern web development, these are general principles of web development which apply to even your JavaScript code, and it is not very Lightning Web Component specific. We'll come to we'll come to understand how Lightning Web Components really imbibe these principles, but these are general principles which are applicable to regular JavaScript as well. So there is custom elements which allows us to, or which allows web developers to create granular components which are reusable. So initially there was this paradigm where web developers ended up building pages, right? But that particular model had a lot of challenges where the pages were basically uh, reusable, but in a very limited way. They added a lot of performance overheads, and the logic, the business logic, the view and the model. So basically, the model view and the controller, they were very, very tightly coupled. So there was no set standard for building these components. So this was one thing which was missing, and which building, I mean, the custom elements paradigm is kind of addressing. The next is the templates piece. So earlier, when anybody wrote a web or anybody was doing web development, he would typically write the UI piece of it, and the UI piece was tightly integrated, which means that uh, if you had to change the styling or the look and feel of your web application, unless you were a very experienced developer and had really good CSS understanding and written reusable CSS, um, it was very, very difficult to do that. And even after that, there was still a very cohesive referencing of uh, you know of writing CSSs. With the advent of templates, what the new web development paradigm allows you to do is web developers are basically building reusable templates where the UI or the styling piece is completely separated out. And as such, if you have uh, if you need your web pages or web components to be very, very to be reusable, you don't really have a problem, because essentially what you end up developing is templates, right? So you have a template keyword, and we'll just see that in a bit, right? The next is imports. So if you have worked with JavaScript for quite some time, there is a concept of modules in components in JavaScript. So modules basically allow you to write a lot of modular and reusable code. So basically, there is an import keyword that you end up using to refer an external module, and you can use that external module to, and can reuse it in your own web component. So basically, that is how imports would work, and that would help streamline and structure out your overall web application, make the code a lot more reusable, and you know uh, it could just be referenced with an import keyword. So that is another principle which is very, very essential, or which adds a lot of benefit to the modern web development paradigm. Last but not the least, there is Shadow DOM. So basically, Shadow DOM is nothing but a concept. So for people who are not really very conversant, Shadow DOM is basically a document object model, right? So what really happens is, whenever a web page is rendered in your browser, it essentially follows a specific tree-like structure, right? And so all the entire page, or your entire HTML that you have, follows a tree-like structure, and that entire structure is really referred to as a document object model, or a DOM. Now, Shadow DOM has been a new concept, right? And it is essentially to provide the flexibility to write customized templates such that you have the power to override them. So let's say you're writing a template which has a list of you know cars being listed down, and it follows a specific UI format. But your requirement is that you want a specific line item to not follow the regular styling that you have. But let's say if all the items are listed in red, for this particular item, due to certain business logic, you want it to follow a different color. So you could use a shadow DOM in this case, and without really modifying the template that you have written, you could use the shadow DOM to override it while sticking to the original uh, rule of the rest of the car items being listed in red. So that's what a shadow DOM is. Don't really get bogged down by these. These are some essential principles that one should know before you start any kind of modern web development, and that's the reason why it's really important to understand them. Now, from there, let's just move to lightning web components. So before we jump into understanding lightning web, understand why lightning web components are needed. uh, let's just understand what exactly are lightning web components. So lightning web components are nothing but a new web development paradigm that Salesforce has recently introduced. And one of the key things that lightning web components have to offer is its compliance with the standard web development paradigms. So now what is the compliance part of it? So earlier, the web development standards were not very uh, feature rich. So we did not have features that we talked about, like templates, and we were all of that was had to be coded for. It was not built into the ECMAScript, right? And as a result, either it involved a lot of coding effort, or it resulted in bad code if people are not aware of these kind of coding patterns and designs, right? So with the advent of the new browsers, especially in the last couple of years, especially after ECMAScript 6, the browsers have become really feature rich, right? And that's the reason why some of the web development principles that we spoke about in this slide are now possible. So generally, if you're really looking of doing any web development on an for a non-Salesforce application, generally it's a combination of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Of course, with this principles in mind, but with with earlier Aura components that Salesforce had, um, Lightning Web they were not complying, or they were not really very open to the overall web development standard. So Aura is a framework of its own, and there is a specific way. Although we're using JavaScript, but it has a very specific way. So it wouldn't really marry in the overall web development paradigm uh, framework or model. And that's the reason why Lightning Web Components were introduced, to ensure that Salesforce development also complies and is more standardized, and it adheres to the overall general web development methodology or model. So there are certain key features that come in with Lightning Web Components, and you might say that most of these features may also have been true for the Lightning Component Framework or the Aura components. But that's true. But one of the key differentiators, so you were also doing a component-based development in the Aura component framework, which is true with Lightning Web Components also. And then hence there is a lot of reusability and granularity, because now you have the flexibility of um, building even the smallest piece of your web page as a reusable component. So it's very much there. But one of the key essentials that Lightning Web Components has to offer is encapsulation, which is basically offered through the feature of Shadow DOM. And the the other feature, which is standardization. So it is very easy for even non-Salesforce web developers to come and build Lightning Web Components on the other hand, because you don't need to really understand a new uh, framework. Of course, it's going to have its specifics and integrities, but that's not going to be, the learning curve is not very steep, and that's the reason why Lightning Web Components really score well and have been introduced. So if you want to develop Lightning Web Components, what is it that you need? Uh, at this moment, if you want to perform Lightning Web Component development, you cannot do that using your dev consoles, uh, which is basically the IDE that is available through the Salesforce web interface. You will need a Studio Code, which is an IDE available, which is an open source IDE, and Visual Studio Code, you need a combination of course, Salesforce CLI, and there is Visual Studio Code has a rich extensions library. So there are a ton of extensions all available for free, which make development easier, faster, and very efficient for all the web developers. So basically, if you got to really set up a Lightning Web Component development environment, you will have to first set up the Salesforce command line interface, right? You can download it from the web URL that it is available at. You will also have to set up and install Visual Studio Code, and last but not the least, you will need to have the Salesforce extensions pack and the Lightning Web Component extension in VS Code. So this is the essential thing. However, don't get bogged down if you're not very conversant with Visual Studio Code or uh, Salesforce CLI. And if you still have the heart to perform Lightning Web Component development, don't worry. Salesforce has a really new powerful tool which is available, and that is the playground. So I'm just going to switch over to the to my playground and show you guys what it looks like. So if you go to developer.salesforce.com and search for you can search for the Lightning Web Component playground, you will be able to see this particular screen. So if any of you are conversant with CodePen, right? So CodePen is nothing but an online editor which allows you to write JavaScript code snippets, and it supports a ton of different JavaScript frameworks. And basically, this particular playground that you see is nothing but a code pen specifically built or implemented for Lightning Web Components. So think of it as an execute anonymous for Apex, good old Apex developers. Think of it as an execute anonymous for Lightning Web Components. So if you want to try out your code snippets and you really don't have the time to set up Salesforce CLI and Visual Studio Code, you can use this particular editor to write your code, test it out, and check if it really works. So it actually shows you a preview screen and things like that. So it allows you to, view and run your code. There are a ton of other features, like you can, save the code for future. You can download it. It just downloads the entire code snippet as a zip file, and you can then use that later and if you want to share this code snippet with somebody else. So very powerful, very simple. We're going to be today, just for showcasing our Lightning Web Component, the development, we will be using this. But before that, let's just go back and really understand what exactly is the Lightning Web Component. What does it look like? Okay, so what I'm first going to do is switch over. I also have Visual Studio Code set up on my machine, and I'm going to share that. So usually if you, so this is how a typical Visual Studio Code editor looks like. And if you really want to, so there are of course some steps, like you will have to create a project, and you'll have to execute some sfdx commands. So if you want to execute some sfdx commands, Control Shift P is the shortcut which brings up this particular command palette, right? So what I'm going to do here is, since I already have my orgs set up and the project created, I'm just going to request for creation of a Lightning Web Component. Okay, so all I'm going to do is tell it to create a Lightning Web Component. So I'm saying I'm going to give it a name, say PDC Hello World 3. So it's going to ask me as to what directory is it going to store it under, and I'm going to say the default directory. And the moment I choose that, it's going to start the operation. And if you really see, it has created a new Lightning Web Component. Okay, so if you see the new Lightning, this is the Lightning Web Component which we requested for creation. And if you see the structure, it is a very simple structure as opposed to the other, as opposed to the Aura component framework, which had a ton of other extra additional JS files. But let me just switch over to my slide deck and show that to you. So if you really see the Aura component structure, right? The Aura component structure was really made up of, the markup, which is more of the view. And then there were a ton of JavaScript files. So there was a client-side controller, there was a helper file, there was a renderer file, and of course the styling CSS, and then the server-side control. So you were actually dealing with a ton of files over here. But if you really look at the Lightning Web Component structure, if and if we try to dissect it, so I'm going to switch back to my playground, or sorry, rather my Visual Studio Code. If you really see, there is a simple HTML file that comes in when you create a Lightning component. There is a JS file that comes in, and then there is an meta XML file. So the HTML file is where we would be writing our markup, right? And if you see that it is not the regular HTML that you're writing, right? It has a specific keyword which says which uses the template keyword, which affirms the usage of the principle which we talked about. Is what we're essentially building is reusable templates, right? The next is the JavaScript piece of code. So this is basically the controller, and this is where all the controller logic goes in, right? There are certain things which we need to understand. Is one of the essential challenges, or the fundamental principles of JavaScript is basically single threaded, which means that if you're doing multiple set of operations, right, they would all be executed asynchronously, and there was no real way to find out which of them would execute and complete back. So there was no real synchronous way of execution, and this would create a lot of problems, especially when you're doing ton of multiple operations together, right? So one of the methods, or solution design patterns, I would say, to deal or address that is basically promises. So what promises does is it allows you to implement chaining. So essentially the response that we get from uh, after the processing, promises envelopes or wraps it up in a specific promises object. Okay, so and the promises object is something that allows you to uh, so basically there are two things: either the promises object returns a value that you expected, or it returns an error, right? And this is what it, but it handles the asynchronous part where you can do method chaining and you can really efficiently get back the response without really having to write any additional extra code. So because everything that the Lightning Web Component returns, it executes in an asynchronous fashion and returns a promise, right? So just promises another development aspect which Lightning Web Components comply to, and that's the reason why it's it's said that it complies with, or it complies with the current web development standards. So that is what the typical JS file is about. If you see the import statement over here, so import comes from the default namespace, but one of the other thing that it complies to is whenever you're writing an import statement, okay, there is a reference to modules. So basically what happens is you can do a lot of reusability. So if you return another JS file or a JS module, you could reference that over here with the import keyword. So this is one another benefit which comes in with Lightning Web Components. And then we have the meta XML file. So for people who've been working on Salesforce for quite some time and have had experience with any of the force.com IDs, the meta XML file is so basically all the metadata that for all the artifacts, whether it's a custom object, a workflow, custom field, it's all stored as an XML file, right? And Salesforce uses the metadata API to manage the metadata. So this is exactly also true for Lightning Web Components, because you have a you have a metadata file where you can do some configurations, and when we start building our component out, we'll see that there are certain specific things that you can do over here to control the visibility of your Lightning component, right? And this also kind of marries into your what you would end up doing for Aura components if you had some experience with Aura components. If you wanted to control on what kind of pages is the Aura component made visible to, then what you would do is you would come and add certain pieces of code over here, and that would kind of specify or control the visibility of the visibility and the availability of the Lightning component, right? So let me just switch back to my presentation. So yeah, the structure, if you see, of a Lightning Web Component is relatively more simple and more intuitive, because now there are only 3 components, although you could add additional files and then reference them, right? So this is what makes up a Lightning Web Component. But before we jump into coding and try to understand, or try to write some code around Lightning Web Components, we also need to understand the life cycle of a Lightning Web Component. So what I'm going to do is just zoom in. Hopefully that will make things clearer, right? So if you're really talking about a Lightning Web Component, just like a Visual Force page, or has a life cycle or an order of execution of Apex and business logic, you also have a life cycle here. Now, the life cycle, this particular diagram explains the life cycle in a way where there is a parent component and there is a child component, right? So how will that work how will the life cycle operate in that particular case? So the first thing that gets called is a constructor. So if you guys just saw the code, there is an extend keyword. So let me just switch back to my Visual Studio Code and show you the JS file. If you see, we're writing, it gives you the illusion that you're writing classes, although we're writing classes, but they're not completely object oriented as as that of Apex or any other object oriented language. But yes, we do end up writing classes, and there is it supports inheritance, and that's the reason why the fundamental type or the fundamental class of every lightning component is so lightning element is the base class, and that is what your lightning web components that you end up writing will extend. So switching back to my presentation. So what really happens is, so the only reason why I was showcasing this is because you have a constructor which gets called, and especially the parent constructor is what will get called first, right? And then what will happen is the component will check if there are any public properties. So public properties are nothing but any regular properties or variables that you would end up creating in any other technology. It's very similar to that, right? And it does have access specifiers. We'll come to that in a bit. But the public property is is checked for, and especially properties here. I mean, Lightning Web Components provide a two-way data binding, which means that if you have a variable, right, which is bound to a UI component, right, and the value in the variable changes, you do not need to refresh the view to view to showcase the refreshed value of the variable. uh, the view will automatically showcase or refresh itself to showcase the refreshed or the new value. That's what is typically two-way data binding. So yeah, it checks for any property values and updates the property values. Then the the component is inserted into the DOM. So like I said, the DOM is a tree structure. The component, because you're building small pieces or small elements of the DOM when you're actually building Lightning Web Components, the component is taken and injected or inserted into the DOM, right? And then there is a connected callback method which happens, and the element is rendered. So after so once once a component is really injected in the DOM, doesn't mean that it is automatically available. The rendering process is what makes it visible and available for usage. Similarly, after the parent rendering process is complete, the same cycle continues with the child elements, right? So if you have multiple nested elements, this is how the typical flow would look like, right? um, there is also, so this is the creation part, but if you have a removal part, or where you're deleting a Lightning Web Component, maybe you are trying to hide it, or make it just remove it from the DOM. There is it also gets unrendered and then removed from the DOM. So we'll see specific methods which are typically relevant to understand the life cycle and which are available. So if for people who've done some bit of Aura development, there was this renderer file, and it would give you some specific methods which would allow you to capture specific lifecycle events and do some operations on that, right? So similarly, here we have these methods which allow you to capture the lifecycle events and perform any specific operations, right? So a classic example of using some of these methods could be that you are trying to build out a page and identify unique views or unique clicks on the page, right? So you only want to do that when the page is loaded first time, right? So you might only want it when the render is called, okay, for the parent component. So you might want to write some logic and say that, okay, when the render is called, update a counter or thing like that, right? So these are some of the standard methods which are available. I'll not get into the details, just some specific ones. So there is render. So there is the constructor which gets called first, right? And then there is a connected callback. So like I said, whenever you start writing Lightning Web Components, Aura Web Components, you'll notice that there will always be a reference to a callback function for in most of the cases, and that kind of ties back to what I was saying earlier. Is JavaScript is asynchronous, which means that you will not get the desired response the response in a desired way. So what really happens is you provide a method and you tell the engine to say that execute this particular method when your processing is done, and you receive back a response. And that method is typically referred to as a callback method. So when a component is really inserted into a DOM, you really have a connected callback method. When a component is removed from the DOM, you have a disconnected callback method. uh, when a component is ready to be used, there is the render method which gets called. And after the render completion, there is a rendered callback method, which basically signifies that the rendering is complete, right? And last, if you get any error in any of the lifecycle methods, there is an error callback method which gets called, right? So these are the typical methods. Now, another very important concept is that of decorators. So don't really get bogged down by these new terminologies. Decorators are nothing very different. You've been writing access specifiers in your code for a very long time, and decorators just fulfill the same capability over here, right? So what are decorators? So when you basically write variables, right? Methods don't really, except for um, yeah, methods will have access specifiers, but specific methods. But typically, when you're defining variables in your Lightning Web Component code, you will have to use some of these decorators. At the moment, there are these 3 decorators which are available. So there is @API. The annotation looks very similar to any. I mean, the syntax looks very similar to any of the Apex annotations, but the meaning is very different here. So @API is a decorator which allows you to define public variables, which means that if you have a variable or a property marked as @API, it could be used across and it's publicly available. All the other modules and classes could use this particular property, right? Similarly, when you are tagging a particular property with @track keyword or @track decorator, what you're essentially defining is a private property, which means that so public properties are accessible everywhere, and even in inherited classes. Sorry, even in inherited classes, but @track, which are private properties, they are only available within that specific class, right? Uh, Now there is another decorator, which is the @wired keyword, and this is particularly used to tag methods and is essential um, when you're doing a server-side call. So let's say you have an Apex method which is retrieving some data, and that data is being showcased on the Lightning Web Component, right? So what really happens is the wired. So all of these decorators are reactive in nature. And what do you mean by reactive? When we say reactive, it means that all of these support two-way binding, which means that if you have a property defined in your class, right, with a value, and if that value changes, it is automatically referenced or showcased on the UI, right? So all of these properties are reactive in nature. So let's just understand, or let's just dive deep and write a very basic hello world Lightning component, just to get a feel of how it is or what it is to write a Lightning component. So for the purpose of demo today, I'm going to be using the playground, right? And what we're essentially going to do is, in the interest of time, I already have my code ready. So I'm just going to copy the code and then walk you guys through what exactly have we written. So let me just first go to the HTML code and paste the template, right? Now, this particular template, so if you see the output window next to this has rendered certain UI components. So basically, Lightning card is already a component which is available even during the Lightning from component framework development. It's just, you can equate it to a normal page block if you're coming from the Visual Force world, right? But there are certain essential elements to understand over here. So um, you can use regular HTML elements, right? So I've used a paragraph or a div, and it just works seamlessly. And there is another input element that I've used is the Lightning input element. So basically, what you understand is you can also use the Aura, uh, the elements from the Aura component framework over here. So Lightning Web Components and the Aura components work well with each other, right? And you can use some of those components, not some, I would say most of them over here to build your Lightning Web component. So the switch wouldn't be very difficult, saying that, okay, I have half of my code written in Aura framework, and now we're planning to move to Lightning Web component development. Uh, the switch is seamless, right? Another thing is, the way in which variables are really referenced. So basically the HTML part is the view part. So again, this follows a MVC pattern where you have the model, the view, and the controller. So the model is typically what comes in, what data we bring out, and from the server. The controller is the JavaScript file, and the view is what we see here. It's basically the template, which is the .html file, right? So let me just put in some code into the controller, and I'll walk you through what the JS code is. So what I've written over here is a very basic hello world component. Okay. So what this particular component is going to do is going to show me a hello world message. But if I give it a variable value, right, I'm going to change something over here. Say hello path to code. Do you see that without even getting refreshed, the page is, or the component is able to see the value which is changing, right? So which confirms our two-way binding feature that we just talked about, that whenever we make changes to any uh, data within the logical model, which is any properties that you may define. In this case, what we have done is we've defined a particular class, right? So what you essentially end up writing is classes, and you extend the Lightning element, which is the base class. What we have done after that is basically defined a simple private property called greeting, and so that is where when you run this, if you see, this is the default value that comes over in the Lightning component, and this is what has been input to this greeting property, right? The same greeting property is also being referenced on the UI, right? So look at the curly brace syntax which is used to write or reference that. And then once this is done, I've written a change handler, right? The change handler is basically, it's an event, right, which is detecting. So basically change handler is a method which is being called on the on change event of the Lightning input text box, and this will send whatever is the value, the state of this particular element to the uh, controller here. So what is happening is all the event data is being sent over here in the change handler method, and what we are just doing is assigning it to the greeting method, the greeting variable. So what happens is, as the state is changing, the value is being assigned to the greeting variable, and we have done nothing for it to refresh or reflect on the UI. So anything, any value I change is being automatically bound to the UI. So this is a key feature that we get with the modern web component development, which wasn't there earlier, and you had to write tons and tons of code to refresh and get the new updated data from the model, right? So with that, so that's what is essentially, that's your first lightning web component. That's not something very different we've done. It's only some of the uh, keywords that you will have to get accustomed to. um, there is one specific piece that I want to really show you is the XML file. So what I'm going to do is just take this XML file for now from here, this, and I'm going to copy and paste this within my Visual Studio Code. So if I just open up the meta XML file, so if you remember, I just talked about that why this XML file is used. So you can actually control the availability of which Lightning web component can be made available where. So whether it is a Lightning page that you are building, or it's the record detail page or the home page. Now, the fact that I have stated all three means this component will be available for being added to all these all these pages, or these areas. However, if you just said that, oh, this is only a home page component and I only want this to be showcased on the home page, so what you can always do is just remove this, and this will only specify that this particular hello world 3 component is going to be available only on the home page. So that's how the meta XML file comes in very, very handy. uh, so that's all about how you can go out and build your own Lightning web components. Um, the easiest, just to give you a simple feature comparison between Lightning web components and Aura components. So you would essentially use an Aura attribute tag in Lightning Aura components, but with Lightning web components, it is the decorators that you would use, and you have the flexibility of using either a public or a private access specifier with @API or @track decorator. Uh, there is also a difference in the way your model variables are referenced. So we had a greeting property, and the only thing you need to do is reference it within an open and a closed curly braces. No exclamations mark needed. No prefixes like C dot B dot are needed. You don't really need Aura handlers and registers, uh, because you can directly have custom events, and what you're essentially doing is writing classes. These classes are capable of returning promises, which means that you can do a lot of method chaining, and implementation becomes way easier, right? Handling responses becomes way easier, and you can, of course, there will be still be subtle differences, but you can use your Aura components or the earlier existing Lightning components while within your Lightning web component development. So of course, a little bit of learning curve over here, but it's not going to be a steep learning curve. It's going to be easy for us, most of us, to adopt that. And with that, I think I kind of come to an end of the session. Let me just go back. Let me just showcase the resources, and then I'll take all the questions that we have, if any. So there are some great resources out there. Playground, which I've already showcased. Uh, but if even there is a sample gallery and a ready-made recipes which are available, so you could use that. So recipes are, there are like about 30 plus recipes which allow you to, like, how do you get data from the server, or you want to do a certain kind of update, all those recipes, code recipes are there, which allow you to try them out. um, then there is a sample gallery with sample web applications, complete applications built on the Lightning Web Component framework. So you really want to see how applications can be built. You can just look at those applications. There are GitHub repositories available. You can just clone them, and they're just easy to adopt to. Your Bible for the Lightning Web Components should be the dev guide, which is a very detailed guide and provides all the nitty-gritties, property details. I think this is your go-to document for all Lightning Web Component development. And last but not the least, we have Trailhead, because nothing's complete without Trailhead, and it also gives you the ability to try out a lot of hands-on activities that we just did right now. So I would strongly recommend that each one of you complete the modern JavaScript development module first before jumping into Lightning Web Components, because that will iron out a lot of questions and queries, because a lot of methodology way and syntaxes, uh, how the Lightning Web Components really operate is kind of inherited from the way JavaScripts are written. So I would strongly recommend you complete that before you jump into the Lightning Web Component basics. There's a basics module, and of course there's a quick start module. So I think there's enough that you can do to get yourself onboarded and learn Lightning Web Components. And with that, yes, we have come to the end of this session. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if we have questions, and let's see what all questions we have. So I believe there's a question from Michael, which says, how can anyone as a new coder bring value to an organization when nearly any experienced admin can achieve goals with continuously enhancing content power of the platform? Can you tell us how Salesforce code recipes can support coders and developer initiatives? See, I think one of the key things that the recipes have to offer is they give you examples to a lot of commonly used real world scenarios. Like the most common example that I can think about is you want to fetch data from through Apex, or you want to fetch data through a web service call out and showcase that on your Lightning component. There is already ready code that is available. So technically the way these recipes will help is it will help you to onboard and learn, but they will offer you solutions and ways to think through how you can really offer a solution to some of your key business problems. They may not encompass all the business problems, but it definitely is a great start and really minimizes the learning curve for you. So Michael, I hope that answers the question for you. So there's a question from Joby which says, Lightning Web Components replace these, or are so does not there the course does not cover Visual Force pages and Lightning Components. Will Lightning Components Web Components replace these, or able to achieve all functionality that VF or Lightning Components are able to achieve? So Joby, the way I mentioned it earlier is, see, Visual Force was a different technology and was a different paradigm, right? When we were essentially building Visual Force pages, we were writing we were doing page-based development, which was very inefficient. There was a lot of performance overhead, especially when you were redirecting from one page to another. Reusability was very minimal, right? So essentially, all that the new web component development frameworks are offering, it was essentially missing. Or even if you had to use it or imbibe it within your Visual Force page, there was tons and tons of code that you had to write. Of course, there was a lot of experience required, but now the web standard automatically supports these, so it becomes very easy with minimalistic code to achieve um, you know features like templating. So it's all ready. Uh, that being said, uh, is Visual Force going to phase out? Uh, well, not that I have heard of from Salesforce. Uh, and usually, what I've known is, even when I started working, there used to be something called as S controls, which were uh, which were stopped, but the older S components which were written then also worked seamlessly even after they were stopped. So the existing uh, components, or your existing Visual Force will will continue to work as they are, unless of course Salesforce puts a mandate, but that's not something that I've heard about. Um, and if you're really comparing Lightning components, which is the Aura components, and Lightning Web components, like I said, Aura components required a different and understanding the Aura framework and JavaScript, right? With the Lightning Web component framework coming in, there is a lot of, it complies with the regular web development standards, which is typical HTML and JS. So it kind of marries in with the regular JavaScript way of development, rather than just making it a very using a proprietary or a very different framework. And that's the reason why Salesforce has introduced Lightning Web Components. Yes, you can achieve whatever you are doing in Lightning components with Lightning Web Components, or vice versa, but it's basically because of these reasons that Lightning Web Components have been introduced. And I think that is the way forward for most of the Salesforce developers, because that is something which Salesforce is kind of uh, putting it on a pedestal in their roadmaps. So yeah. um, okay. There's another question for Joby which says, can you explain the metadata API and how they are used? Okay, so typically what happens is, so metadata API is nothing but an API which allows you to access and modify the metadata on the Salesforce platform. So just to understand, Salesforce, to everything that you build on Salesforce is stored as an XML file, right? And it's transferred over as an XML file. So whenever you have any kind of component being built, and if you have an editor, I don't really have another org where I could show you. So even if you look at an Apex class, or if you look at a custom object or custom setting, or any artifact that you're building on the Salesforce platform, it's all being stored as an XML file, and you can use that to modify your metadata. So it's not only through the UI, but you can do it through those XML files. And it also comes in handy where you want to do deployments. So let's say let me just give you an example. As a developer, you want to copy a workflow from one org to another. Okay, what you can simply do is take the XML, use the XML file in from one org, copy it and paste it into a project of the other orgs, of the other Salesforce org, and it will just work seamlessly, provided the dependencies are uh, all taken care of. So basically, it's a API for metadata manipulation on the Salesforce platform. You can even do deployments. So just like the way you deploy artifacts using chain sets, you can use metadata API to um, deploy your metadata through code. So that's how essentially a metadata API is used.
Yeah, hi Jigar, this is Amit. And
Yeah,
I also want to add a couple of points for the metadata API. So with the help of metadata, like if it's like there are a couple of utility which we can go with the point and click thing. So if you want to do something with the code, like suppose you have a requirement to create the object from some code. So in that particular scenario, you can use the metadata API and create the object. And if suppose you have a requirement to create metadata values, that what you can use, and apart from that workflow you can create by the code. So metadata API provide you extra capability so that you can create all this configurable stuff with the help of code itself. So sometimes this kind of scenario come and we can expose the metadata file and use the metadata API and create some custom object and something with the help of code as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amit. Yeah, essentially it just metadata API just gives you a more programmatic access to your metadata of the Salesforce platform and gives you a very finer control. So yeah, and I believe there is one question which is from JS, which says that if you have a community which is using Aura components with the v dot syntax, so is it recommended to change to LWC? So if you're in the middle of the development, I wouldn't really recommend doing that. I would prefer that you either you know build something completely on Lightning Web Components or you build something on Aura. You don't really have to change that. But like I said, if you have a page where you have some components are built as Aura components, right? Using the Lightning component framework. And now you're thinking whether I can build the next component on Lightning using Lightning Web Components. The answer is yes, you can do that because they work with each other in tandem. There is no conflict per se, and that's the reason. But answer to your question is, if you're already in the middle of the development, please don't change it. It's not, you shouldn't adopt something just because it's new. Uh, but operationally, do they interfere with each other? Is there a challenge? Is there a conflict? Answer to the question is no. All right. Okay, I think.
Yeah, apart from that, I want to add one more point here. So like suppose if you are already using Aura and you think like you are comfortable in LWC, if you need to create an independent component, you can build that in LWC, and that particular component you can use inside the Aura as well. So don't create everything from the scratch, but yeah, new component you can start with LWC and use it into Aura, in the Aura.
Yep, thanks for that. I believe we've answered most of the questions. If there is, yeah, if there are more questions, feel free to, share the questions on the blog or the YouTube channel in the comment section, and we'll be more than happy to answer. With that, I think brings us to the end of this session. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful and patient audience and being so interactive. Thank you, Amit, for adding your 2 cents, and Maria for being there on the call today. And
thank you guys. Great stuff.
Just keep tuned, stay tuned to our channel. We'll be shortly posting the videos to the YouTube channel, and we have another session, a very interesting session lined up next week, which is going to be done by Amit. And it's also going to be on Lightning Web Components, but it's going to be more of a deep dive. So don't miss it, and do join in. So thank you once again. Bye-bye.